Again, we'll return to our third session of the workshop. Our next speaker is one of the famous students of our earlier speaker. Nazif Muhtaroğlu received his bachelor's and master's degree from Boğaziçi University and then went to University of Kentucky to work under Brandon Look and received his PhD with a thesis on Islamic and Cartesian roots of occasionalism. Then he went to Harvard University, the Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations program with a postdoctoral fellowship. Nazif Muhtaroğlu works in Islamic philosophy, Islamic theology, and of course early modern philosophy as well. He is back at Boğaziçi University this year, and we are absolutely delighted to have him, and this conference is one of the results of this. He's interested these days, I asked him what he's working on these days, and it's the relation between occasionalism, science, ethics, and other topics like this. So, our next speaker, Nazif Muhtaroğlu.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. So, primarily I'd like to share some comments on Brandon's introduction to rationalist tradition. Actually, 1 or 2 days ago, I think, all the group together, we are moving here from here to the other parts of Istanbul together, and I asked, is everybody here? Somebody said, I think, I'm not sure. That's a kind of philosophical answer. However, I said, for practical purposes, let's say, if we are here. So, for practical purposes, I considered, it would be easier to categorize the philosophers of the earlier section as rationalists and the philosophers of this section were empiricists, but I certainly share Brandon's remarks on the vagueness of characterizing these traditions. So we will see again here many connections with Malebranche and these philosophers here. I will mainly focus on Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. So we should question maybe the distinction between continental rationalists and the British island empiricists also. They have certain differences, but also many things in common. So I have 51 slides. It's a bit long maybe, but I would like to use the same procedure with Jeff's presentation. As I continue, you can interrupt me, you can share your comments, ask any questions. Maybe that way you can hope to finish the whole slides. Otherwise, there may not remain any minutes for discussion. Some significant works of these philosophers: Malebranche's Search After Truth, published in 1674-5, and just after that, to respond to criticisms directed to the book, he publishes elucidations of the search 2-3 years later. Locke's essay in 1689 or 90, and interestingly, Locke has a book on Malebranche, specifically entitled An Examination of Pierre, Father Malebranche's Opinion of Seeing All Things in God, prepared in 1693, but posthumously published. Berkeley's Principles of Human Knowledge and On Motion, maybe also the Third Dialogues are relevant, published in 1710, 30, and 21. And Hume's Treatise of Human Nature, 1739 or 40, and Inquiry, 1748. So I would like to give a brief introduction to Malebranche's occasionalism. Certainly, we can't talk much about that, but the inspirations that we see Malebranche has about occasionalism is not just originates from Descartes' mind and body problem. He has much more theological type of motivations. In the chapter when he elaborates on occasionalism, the chapter starts with the title of the most dangerous error of the philosophy of the ancients. And what is that error? This error is ascribing power to finite things. So he quotes from Augustine saying, whatever cruelly acts upon us, it's above us, and inferior things serve to superior things. Thus if we are under the control of secondary causes, we should also serve them. So believing in genuine secondary causality leads to paganism, according to this background. And he says Christians in Europe at that time are Christian in their heart, but basically pagan in their mind, just because of this idea. Anyway, so the terminology occasional cause occasionality, introduced first according to some historians by Louis de la Forge, Brandon just mentioned. However, Malebranche modifies this idea. Occasional cause, maybe in La Forge's terminology, is something like the following. The fire is the occasional cause of my sensation of heat, or this body is the occasional cause of my idea of this body. In that sense, it is causally inert, it doesn't affect on me, but my mind produces the idea. The causal agent here is the finite being, my mind. However, for Malebranche, occasional causes are still causally inert, but they provide occasion for divine causality. God is the sole causal agent here. Minds are causally inert. However, why he uses the term occasional cause? Occasional cause, whenever you see, refers to a certain order. So miracles are not, for example, occasional causes, because they are very particular, unique events. Whenever we would like to talk about the order in nature, we don't use the term natural cause because it may imply something, natural powers or capacities. But we use the term occasional cause to indicate that God sustains the order in the world in that specific way. So Leibniz calls this theory the system of occasional causes, and Kant, as far as I know, to the extent of my knowledge, introduces the term occasionalism to differentiate Malebranche's theory from Leibniz's pre-established canon. Okay, this theory basically says that everything is created by God or recreated by God. All finite beings, minds and bodies equal, are causally inert, and there is a regularity in nature sustained by God. I mean, there's a certain order. It is not arbitrarily happening everything. Basic example also shared by many Muslim thinkers. If you have a piece of fire near a piece of cotton, the occasional cause here is a fire, not the efficient cause. God is the real efficient cause of the burning of cotton. The true cause is the sister term, how to say, of occasional cause, because true cause refers to true efficient cause, which is God in the system. And according to Malebranche, the true cause is something that we perceive a necessary link between it and its effect. He says in The Search After Truth, a true cause, as I understand, it is one such that the mind perceives a necessary connection between it and its effect. Now the mind perceives a necessary connection between the will of an infinite perfect being and its effect. Therefore, it is God who is the true cause and who has the power to move the bodies. I say further, A, that it is inconceivable that God communicates his power to move bodies to men or angels. and B, that those who claim that our power to move our arms is a true power should admit that God can also give minds the power to create, manipulate, and do all possible things, in short, that He rendered them omnipotent. Actually, he makes it very clear that the link, the causal link, is a necessary link. That is to say, it is not only actually true that God is the sole causal agent, it is necessarily true that God is the sole causal agent. It is impossible, otherwise it's impossible. This is true in all possible worlds. And it will be a contradiction according to Malebranche if you ascribe a certain causality to finite beings. That is to say, there is just one type of causality which is, whatever we call it, boils down to creation. The real divine activity. Okay, this is a basic sketch of the argument. That's it. We call the first argument I presented the non-necessary connection argument. In the literature, it is so-called, as Brandon pointed out. And the other one, also Brandon mentioned that, conservation is but continuous creation argument. Here, to understand the argument and to whom it is directed, we should keep in mind that creation is conceptually different from, creation, not creation, conservation is conceptually different from creation ex nihilo, but they are really the same. This is a common assumption between the Cartesians and the Scholastics. And Malebranche, on the basis of this assumption, produces his argument for occasionalism, arguing that if they are really the same, and the difference is just a conceptual difference, and if God created the world initially by creation ex nihilo, whatever power he uses later to conserve the world is the same. We must accept that the world is recreated in the later stages. And in arguing for this thesis, Malebranche probably relies on Laforge's presentation, because remember, Laforge talks about creating an object at a certain specific location. That is to say, the substance of the object and the modes of the object, the location, etc., other types of things, must be created by the same agent. You cannot formulate an agent for the creation of substance and another agent for the creation of the modes of that substance, because you cannot separate them. The modes cannot be separated from the substance. The substance is always in a certain mode. If you create a substance, you create it in a definite mode. And this is the basic idea behind the argument proposed by Laforge. And Malebranche, basing his argument on this intuition, says gives a similar argument here in the seventh dialogue on the dialogues on religion. And Brandon actually quoted this, I pass it. But the point here is that the armchair cannot exist as without somewhere. It should exist somewhere with a certain modification. Whoever creates the substance of the chair, it is or he is the creator of the modes of the chair. So you cannot formulate, for example, a causal agent like God for the creation of the substance of the chair, and another causal agent like whatever secondary cause for the creation of the modes of the substance. And then you end up with occasionalism. No aspect of the world is subject to the causal influence of something else other than God. Epistemic argument, the so-called stupid argument, again. Oh yeah.
Can I slow you down there just for a second? Why is that? Right? You might think, for proponents of the secondary causation, you might think, look, the substance has to be created ex nihilo.
The substance?
Yeah. So you think, okay, so let's suppose God's got to do that. You might think then, well, what about the modes? Could something other than God create the modes?
In the first instance, creation ex nihilo, you mean? Or?
Suppose it subsequent instant.
The first instance?
Subsequent, after.
Oh, so
After, sorry.
I think in order to answer this question, we should first look at the first instance of creation, the first created thing, as creation ex nihilo, to understand what is creation ex nihilo. So, whatever is created in the first instance, whatever we call it, Big Bang or whatever, it must be in a certain mode according to Cartesian metaphysics. If that is the case, God is responsible, or the creation ex nihilo is responsible for the creation of both the substance and the modes. If this is the case, and if we, on the basis of this fact, we look at the later stages of the universe, we cannot formulate a separate causality for the substance and another separate causality for the modes, because they must be the same with the initial creation, right? This is why we must describe.
So maybe you can even do it at the first instance. Like I'm not sure that follows, but you know, so you said a little bit about dependence. I know you were thinking about grounding. You might think, you know, suppose causation is a kind of dependence. You might think the substance depends on God, but the modes might depend on the substance.
Oh, dependence. Good question.
And you might think, you know, in some sense that gets at what the proponents of secondary causation are thinking, that the task of making a mode is a lesser task than the task of making a substance. Precisely because the task of making a substance means creation ex nihilo, whereas the task of making a mode doesn't presuppose creating something ex nihilo. It requires modifying something that already exists. And you might think the one could belong to finite agents when the former only belongs to an infinite agent.
And moreover, it's a modification of a principal attribute in the Cartesian metaphysics. So it's not that you come up with something completely new. If God creates you or me, He creates you as a thinking thing, because that's a primary attribute. That's ex nihilo. But when I come to have a thought, that's not ex nihilo in the sense that it would come from nowhere, because I'm already somehow thinking things. It's a modification of something.
But this is for later stages.
At later stages, yeah. But
If you think of it in terms of dependence, I mean, so it's a nice thing that you're pressing on is the earlier
Sure.
and later, as they are too. But I think, and we could think through that as well, which is a good thing to think through. But you know, taking your pressing, you might think, look, even at the first instance, you might think if causation is something like dependence, then even in the first instance, you might think the mode depends on the substance, and the substance depends on God. In which case, even at the first instance, you might grant that there is a sense of secondary causation.
And this is actually what is at issue with occasionalism and monism. And this is how I think Malebranche's philosophy can be separated from Spinozistic monism. It's just about the idea of dependence. Because I think we can distinguish between causal dependence and distinguish causal dependence from ontological dependence in the following way. So Descartes talks about, you know, infinite substance, finite substances, modes, etc. The finite substances are those that do not depend on anything except God. The modes are the things that depend on substances to exist. But his talk is very ambiguous. He doesn't clearly identify different senses of dependence in question. And I think there are two different senses of dependence here. The way a certain finite substance depends on God, the infinite substance, is quite different from the way in which the finite modes are dependent upon the finite substances. Because, for example, we can talk about a certain substratum that has certain accidents. In that sense, we don't have to formulate any causality between the accidents and the substratum. We just say these substrates are with that substratum. These accidents are with that substratum. This laptop, assuming that a finite substance is gray, okay? It has that particular rectangular shape. It is whatever, you know, properties you can see here. These are accidents, but they do not causally depend on this particular substance. They ontologically depend. They do not have to, dependent on causally. They cannot exist alone. there must be some particular, substratum that on which they inhere, according to Cartesians. And this is why we can make a distinction between, the dependence of the modes on the substance, a particular substance, and the substance's dependence on that in terms of ontological dependence and the causal dependence. If you make that distinction, then, and look at the first initial creation stage, in the first initial creation stage, whatever is created, I don't know whether we call it Big Bang or not, let's call it Big Bang. The particular aspects, the properties of Big Bang and the substance of Big Bang, there is a dependence relationship between there, okay? The properties depend on the Big Bang. Ontologically, whatever is created, the substance of Big Bang is created, a certain agent, must be accompanied by the creation of its properties with the same agent, and this creation is the causal dependence of this first event on the creator, but whatever is created, the properties and the substance of Big Bang are ontologically dependent. Yeah, the properties of Big Bang are ontologically dependent on the substance of Big Bang. Another dependence would be logical dependence. For example, Malebranche is very clear on that, and many other, occasionalists in the Muslim tradition. It is not possible that God can create something contradictory. Why? Because, for example, even not just logically contradictory things, maybe metaphysically contradictory things. Al-Ghazali says, for example, somebody cannot be at the same place, at two different places at the same time. They must depend on a certain place. Why? Because there is a kind of metaphysical dependence here. God cannot violate this principle. But this is not something causal. It is created by God. God is the only causal agent here. Something contradictory cannot be created. Why? It violates the logical condition. But this is not causal requirement. It is logical requirement. There are certain preconditions of creation, any causal application, any application of power. These preconditions may include ontological conditions, logical conditions, metaphysical conditions, whatever. I think they are different from causal applications, the application of power.
I don't want to hold things up, but it seems like there's something to think through about. If you're going to call the dependence of creatures on God causation, then it seems it'll be a little odd to think that, then the modes depending on substances, that's not causation. Right? I think for us,
causation, yes.
For us, I don't think we usually think of dependence as being causation. But since Suarez at least, right, they're already thinking of creation and conservation as being instances of efficient causation. And if you think that that's efficient causation, then I think there's some reason to think that, well, if that kind of support or dependence is going to be called causation, in that case, then you might also think modes on their substances should also be thought of as causation.
Yeah, I think the issue centers around what we mean by dependence, maybe. Yeah.
I'm almost jumping. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the epistemic argument is also seen in Malebranche about moving the fingers, the hands, etc. We don't know how to move them, but we are moving, so we are not the agents of this movement. I don't want to talk much about this argument. Maybe if you wish, we can continue, but anyway. I think here knowledge is a necessary condition for causality, but not sufficient. He identifies, he doesn't talk about the causal link here, just in identifying who is the causal agent. He proposes a certain condition, and this argument alone does not establish occasionalism in my view. It just proposes a certain necessary condition only, if it works. So bodies are inefficient things, causally inefficacious because they are extended. Brandon talked about that. If we observe the nature of bodies, we understand that their essence is extension. then it is too difficult to ascribe them causality. And here, Malebranche gives the famous example of bullet balls. I mean, you will see it in Cube as well. And by the way, when I searched the other texts in the period before preparing this presentation, I observed that many people use these ball examples in that age. You know, you see it in Locke, in some other philosophers. I don't know why. Maybe somebody has an idea. It's a good exemplification of maybe the mechanistic system. I don't know. Also, the minds are causal inefficacious. The mind-body problem. So, in literature, there is the idea that Malebranche or the Cartesians introduced occasionalism to solve the mind and body problem. I think this is a very misleading approach to occasionalism. So, Malebranche says bodies are causally inert, minds are causally inert. So, it is not just the problem, you know, the mind-body problem is not just on the table. His remarks are very general and motivations are very different just from solving the mind and body problem. And when you introduce occasionalism, one of the problems solved is mind and body problem. But I don't think it's the main motivation. Here, I would like to have some brief remarks on human agency or human responsibility, because this is one of the repeated objections to occasionalism, and Malebranche's view on this issue is usually overlooked. We will see Locke is one of the points of his criticism is directed toward the human responsibility as well. So the presumption, I think, behind treating people, rendering people irresponsible once occasionalism is accepted, is the following presumption. Responsibility, human moral responsibility, can be defended only on the basis of ascribing causality to human beings. I think this assumption should be questioned, and this is here what Malebranche says. God creates us speaking, walking, thinking, willing, that He causes in us our perceptions, sensations, impulses, in a word, that He causes in us all that is real and material. I deny that God creates us as consenting precisely insofar as we are consenting or resting with a particular good, whether true or apparent. God creates us, then, not precisely insofar as we are consenting or withholding our consent, but insofar as we are able to give or withhold it. The point here, as far as I understand, within our mental states, there are some first-order states, first-order mental states, like desires, pains, pleasures, whatever. They are created by God. But among the mental states, there are some second-order mental states which can be seen once we have the first-order desires, and they appear on the basis of the first-order desires and make choices. Once, for example, I have the desire to drink water, which is the first-order desire created by God, I, as the human moral agent, make a choice between the physical action of drinking water and not. But this emerges, how to say, emerges, a very contemporary term, once I have the first order desire. And it relates my first order desires to the physical action. It's a relation. It's not something in itself definitely existing, but it's a kind of relation that connects my first order desires to the physical action. In that sense, it is not something real to be created at all. It doesn't have causality, it is not created. And this is why God doesn't determine my will. And this is why I am causally important as well, even in my choices. But still I bear responsibility because God creates in accordance with my choices. And this idea, Malebranche presents maybe superficially, elaborated and presented much more in detail by Muslim philosophers. On Tuesday, people talk about Mu'tazila, Ash'ari, the two main traditions, but the Maturidi tradition is ignored and overlooked. And from the Maturidids, a famous philosopher called Sadr Sharia from the 14th century, Ibn Humam. These philosophers usually focused on the nature of human will and proposed a solution within an occasionalist framework, considering human will as a relational state. So I don't want to talk much about that, but there is such a background of this debate. I think the alternative approach of human responsibility here is to considering responsibility, moral responsibility can be justified without ascribing efficient causality to the agent. Okay, science and laws of nature. Malebranche is very interested in science, and in his library there are many books on natural science, as we see from the catalog of his library. The causal links in nature, which can be identified by the scientists, are considered to be occasional causes and not really natural efficient causes, and there are correlations between phenomena rather than real causal links. And Malebranche talks about the general will of God, which gives the content of laws of nature. When we see the order in general in the universe, this is so because God creates everything in accordance with a general will. But sometimes, in a very unusual cases, for certain reasons, He can also create with particular wills, and then we observe miracles. Okay, now the British philosophers. I think before covering the ideas of Locke, Berkeley, and Hume, it would be proper to give some ideas about some English Malebranchians, as they are called. Charles McCracken has a good book called The Malebranche and British Philosophy. There's a chapter on English Malebranchians there. He considers John Norris, Thomas Taylor, Arthur Follier as English Malebranchians who followed Malebranche's ideas there. And we should also keep in mind that in England, around 1690s, two translations of The Search After Truth were available. Two translations, not just one. And if you look at, and in Ireland, there was a reading group at Trinity College discussing Malebranche's works. This is not just the story in the British Island. In the continental Europe as well, Malebranche's ideas were widely discussed, and there were some reading groups all over Europe, in Germany, Italy as well. If you look at Andrew Pyle's book, Malebranche, after describing all these, reading groups, philosophers, etc., he says Malebranche was maybe one of the most famous philosophers in the 17th century, especially toward the end of the century. I don't know, the Hume scholars maybe disagree, but Hume was known as a historian rather than a philosopher in his time. I don't know, what do you think? He was famous as a historian initially, right? Or not? Yeah? Okay. But then, he became the master philosopher of our age. Anyway, so, John Locke wrote an examination of Father Malebranche's opinion of seeing all things in God. This is especially focused on Malebranche's epistemology, which we call the vision in God. However, some issues with occasionalism emerges, especially after that. Locke also wrote a book on remarks upon some of Mr. Norris's books. John Norris, we just mentioned in the first slide, where he extensively deals with occasionalism. And in his essay, also, I will point some ideas of Locke on causality. So, some significant criticisms offered by Locke are the following. Occasionalism undermines human freedom, and quote, brings us to the religion of Hobbes and Spinoza by resolving all, even the thoughts and will of man, into an irresistible, fatal necessity. The second criticism, if God is omnipotent, he can give powers to his creatures. And the third criticism, if God causes our sensory ideas directly, and all delicate contrivances of the eye and the ear, so much admired by the anatomists, become entirely random. Why then we care about the rest? You are the best, forget the rest, as the saying goes. Why should we care about the rest then, if God is, directly creates the mental states? So these are the criticisms of Locke. However, Malebranche considered and responded these criticisms in his works. I don't know why Locke didn't deal with those responses. Wasn't he aware of them, or I don't know. He just gives these criticisms, and that's it. But then, what is Locke's view on causality? If you look at in his essay, he, on the origin of the ideas of cause and effect, he says, in the notice that our senses take the constant vicissitudes of things we cannot but observe, that several particular but qualities and substances begin to exist, and that they receive their existence from the application and operation of some other being. From this observation, we get our ideas of cause and effect. I think Dr. Shehadis, in Dr. Shehadis' presentation, talked about the early Kalam view on the principle of causality, where we get the idea of causality. He mainly emphasized that these people think the beginning of existence of something coming into being is the ground of ascribing causality to a certain nature. I think Locke shares a similar idea to that. Why we think that there are some causal agents in nature or in the world, in reality? Because we see some things that come into being, that have a beginning. This is why we need to ascribe causality to some agents that brings them into being. And who are these causal agents? The clearest idea of active power comes from the spirits. I mean, initially, primarily from our observation of ourselves. Because interacting bodies give a very obscure idea of an active power of moving in a body. We observe them only to transfer, but not to produce motion. Here Locke admits that there is a problem with the bodily powers. They are not so obscure. And he says, the idea of beginning of motion we have only from reflection on what passes in ourselves, where we find by experience that barely by willing it, barely by a thought of the mind, we can move the parts of our bodies which were before at rest. But once we come to our observation, the introspection, I would say, in our own body, our own spiritual state or mental state, we observe that our mind and our volitions initiate certain bodily movements. And this is where we get the primary idea of causality, or I would say power. And on the basis of this idea, he also considers that bodies have certain causal powers affecting us, our sensations, etc. So, according to Locke, both bodies and minds are causally active. In addition, Locke also believes in God, but it's not so clear to me what kind of causality he ascribes to God. You know, does he that constantly sustains the causal powers of these, minds and bodies? It's like mere conservationism, or is it like concurrentism of Suarez, or whatever? I don't know. If anybody would like to share ideas, I would be happy on this issue. And Berkeley, the principles of human knowledge in 1711, 3 dialogues, 13, and on motion, 1721. So we should keep in mind that Berkeley's ontology has two main components: spirits and ideas. So to be perceived, to be is to be perceived or to perceive. To be perceived refers to the ideas; they are perceived. And to perceive refers to the spirits or the minds; they are the ones who perceive. So whatever there is either an idea or a spirit, no material substance. Here Feminist rejects this. But the point is, ideas are passive, spirits are active. And I think this is where there is a huge discussion in the literature about whether Berkeley was influenced by Malebranche or not, or if influenced, to what extent. There are different arguments, positions, but at least we see many parallels. However, once we come to the spirits, human agents, or the other kind of mental beings, minds, Berkeley is very clear on that. They are causally efficacious. They are not causally inert. He says, we move our legs ourselves. This with that will their movement. Herein I differ from Malebranche. Now, with respect to spirits, Berkeley clearly ascribes causality to spirits, whereas Malebranche does not. And he makes that point very early in his notebooks. However, once we examine his view on ideas, we see clear, occasionalist descriptions. By the way, the interpretation I propose for Berkeley is something like a kind of limited occasionalism. That is to say, ideas are causally inert, but spirits are causally efficacious. A limited occasionalism. I think Jeff will talk about Berkeley on Saturday about the real nature of this causality in the spirits. How God is involved in this, in the creation of effects that are also relevant to spirits. Is there kind of concurrentism or whatever? I think Jeff will talk about this issue on Saturday. So in principles, Berkeley says, all our ideas, sensations, or things, which we perceive by whatsoever names they may be distinguished, are visibly inactive. There is nothing power of agency included in them, so that one idea or object of thought cannot produce or make an alteration in another. To be satisfied of the truth with this, there is nothing else requisite but a bare observation of our ideas. He thinks just a bare observation of our ideas is enough to come to that conclusion. But then what is the cause of our ideas? Quote, we perceive a continual succession of ideas. Some are anew excited, others are changed and totally disappear. There is therefore some cause of these ideas whereupon they depend, and which produces and changes them. The cause of ideas is an incorporeal active substance or spirit. I think there is a similar point here with Locke, because the reason why we ascribe causality to a certain agent is that we observe certain ideas anew excited, change, and there are some, appearances and disappearances. Again, close to the early Kalam, we want why we need causality. And now, divine agency. I continue. These are the successive paragraphs in the text. I find I can excite my ideas in my mind at pleasure and vary and shift the scene as often as I think fit. But whatever power I may have over my own thoughts, I find the ideas actually perceived by sense have not a light dependence on my will. When in broad daylight I open my eyes, it is not in my power to choose whether I shall see or not, or to determine what particular objects shall present themselves to my view. The imprinted ideas on them are not creatures of my will. There is therefore some other will or spirit that produces them. And the ideas of sense are more strong, lively, and distinct than those of my imagination. They have a steadiness, order, coherence, and are not excited at random, as those which are effects of human wills often are, but in a regular train or series. The admirable connection whereof sufficiently testifies the wisdom and benevolence of its order. Now the set rules or established methods, wherein the mind we depend on excites, and as the ideas of sense are called the laws of nature. I think Berkeley thinks the regularity, the certain order we observe in the succession of ideas, the coherence, steadiness, are certain indications of a supreme kind of spirit which can do that in accordance with certain laws, which are called the laws of nature. This is the last paragraph of Berkeley. The connection of ideas does not imply the relation of cause and effect, but only of a mark or sign with the thing signified. The fire which I see is not the cause of the spin of the piece. Pain, I think, yeah, maybe. I suffer upon my approach of it, but the mark of that forewarns me of it. You see here, as we will see in David Hume, pure observations of events, cannot establish causal links, just correlations. But he doesn't call them cause and effect. He uses the term sign and signified, and he thinks that would be a better formulation of what is going on here. Because what would be then cause and effect if they are not the real causes? They signify something for practical purposes. Okay, practice is very important, as I said in the beginning of my talk. They forewarns us about what is going to happen. If you touch the fire, you will feel pain. And there is a certain regularity here. And this fire signifies this fact if I do this movement toward the fire. Okay, now I will move to Hume. If you have any questions so far, or any, how much do you have? 20 minutes? Yes.
I just have a question about the second argument that you gave on Malebranche.
Okay. Creation, yeah, continuous creation. Continuous creation argument? Or which one? Okay, let's go there.
After the knowledge argument.
After the knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, so.
This one?
No, after this one. Yeah, what is the record? So, so this is an argument for occasionalism.
I think this is not much an argument, it's just a formulation of the view that what minds are inefficient.
I see. So is he saying, I was just clear, is he saying that the idea of extension doesn't include the idea of power?
Yes, he accepts that.
Right.
with respect to bodies.
Right. But later on, at the bottom passage, the same slide, you say the idea of extension excludes the concept of power. And these two are distinct propositions. Which one is not?
Which one? The idea of extension does not include.
So the first one says does not include the idea of power.
Mm-hmm.
And the last one says excludes the idea of power.
I think Malebranche identifies them.
You think
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Okay. Alright, thanks.
Okay. Yes, Jeff.
If we can ask about one, maybe ask you a little bit more about the responsibility bit.
Oh, yeah.
The way you made it sounds like you said it was emergent. You know, you get higher order volitions are emergent upon first order volitions.
Mm-hmm.
And then some suggestion that you might not be responsible for your first order volitions, but somehow the presence of the second order ones might make you responsible.
Yes.
I wasn't quite sure I saw how that seemed plausible. But if the second order volitions just emerge from the first order ones, and God's giving you the first order ones, it's a little hard to see how you're getting any extra traction on responsibility.
Oh,
Right? You know, if
you think the ground determines the upper, the base
the way
determines
you,
the
the way you presented it, it seemed like it didn't seem like as long as I'm not determining those second order
maybe the
determinations.
term, this is why I was hesitating to use the term emerges there, because of its contemporary connotations. Here, I don't think Malebranche thinks that the base ground determines the second up ground. You are free in choosing between the action and the non-action. Once you have the primary evolutions, the first order evolutions. It just provides a context for you to make your choice. It just provides a context. It doesn't force you to do that choice.
But if you don't have any, I mean, this is, I take it, the intuition that people are worried about the occasionalists is that, you know, what's determining which, suppose we call the one A and the other B, and I'm not a cause, then, you know, I
And
can't determine
it is
A
not
or
a real act. It is not a real act that needs to be causally determined.
B. And how does that make me
It's a
responsible?
relational state. And this is why I use the term relation. It's a relational state that connects one fact to another fact. It's a relational state. This is why it is not created. For example, you know, another example from Sadr Sharia. He says, okay, look at this bottle of glass and this, you know, whatever it is. This glass is on the right of this thing in terms of my perspective, but it's on the left in terms of your perspective. Is it on the right or on the left? Which one is correct? It depends on perspective. The relation of leftness or rightness is not something that definitely exists, but appears, you know, as a result of certain things that exist. This might be an idea that gets you closer what they try to say. I think we'll
Yeah, I don't follow this idea of my volitions or concurring being relational. I mean, they're obviously not extrinsic relations, like being left of something else. Because it's not a question of perspective in any sense. I mean, it's an actual concurring that I do.
This is just an example about relation to exemplify the ontological status of relations. Certainly they are not, but the ontological status of relations doesn't need causality. Nobody can say that the leftness or rightness is created here.
But you
There are some, this is an example to open a door or on another ontological category that there are some things in our intelligible discourse which are not created, but we are talking about sensibly.
Yeah, there are extrinsic relations, and I'm not sure if I see how a second order desire could be an extrinsic relation. It seems to be an intrinsic relation, in the same way as the fact that God created the world is a relational fact between God and the world, but it's still a created thing. I'm just not following. Maybe it's.
But what if it's an intrinsic relation? What problem will emerge if it's an intrinsic relation?
Then it's not a real thing. Then,
How?
I mean, it seems like there's a shitload of extrinsic relations. Like there's an extrinsic relation between me and Eiffel Tower and me not being in Mars and so on and so forth. All kinds of
Okay,
properties,
but the intrinsic relations.
Well, intrinsic relations, like I suppose the fact that I'm someone's son seems like an intrinsic relation to me.
Okay, good point. The sun. But you are created. The relation of sun being sun is not created there. It's called once you are created. The body is created, not the relation. Yeah, Dr. Shah.
I mean, so is it that God creates the choice between X and not X?
No, God doesn't create a
You
choice.
know, drink tea and I say yes or no. Is that
Can you repeat the question?
so? God creates choice. Drink tea and I say yes or no.
God doesn't create the choice.
So what does God?
God creates my desire to drink tea.
So yeah, the choice between X and Y. I mean, choice is a bit ambiguous here.
Yeah,
Drinking tea or not drinking tea at a certain moment, and I say yes or no to drinking tea. And if that's the choice I make, then it's more than a relation. But I want to make the connection between this and the concept of modes. So if God creates modes, I mean, are there mental modes? And within this choice be a mode of some sort, an emotion of some sort within one?
in Cartesian terminology, what is called accident in Islamic terminology is called modes.
So how does it apply to mental choices, let's say?
Oh, the second order,
Yes.
volitions. They are.
Because there's motion.
This is why I try to, use the term relational state as a new term.
Oh, you
Because, not to confuse it with the, mental modes or accidents. It's something different, a different ontological category, I think. Yes.
Is it something like disposition and manifestation or disposition?
I don't know what you may.
So this desire, there is this desire, and God creates the desire, and you cannot act on it. The conditions are like it's going to be manifestation.
Okay.
So is
You
this
may
a
not
relation
act
like
as well.
that?
You may not act as well, right?
Dispositions, they don't necessarily need to be manifested.
If we open a door for the other possibility, you can say that I have the disposition to drink tea, but it is not necessary that it will be manifested. That's okay then.
Or is it something like a supervenience relationship?
I am very hesitating to use these terms because they imply certain kind of determination of my choice.
Yes.
This is why I'm trying to use different terminology here.
Sorry, I mean, does Malebranche speak of mental modes? Just like
Mental,
bodies?
sure, he talks about modes.
So if all modes of bodies have to be created by God, why
Yes.
is there exception? Why does he make an exception to mental modes? Why?
Because he thinks those modes that bear the responsibility, which I call the second order modes or whatever, have a different ontological status. This is the idea behind his mind.
So, is it related to finite minds?
Finite minds, in what sense? Which is related to finite minds?
Is it related to finite?
The human choice?
Yes, the discussion.
Sure. Once you have finite modes which are created, you make a choice between a choice that connects your mode of your created mode initially appeared to the created action. But you may also choose not to do something, then your choice would connect the initially created mode to a non-action. The option in which there is no action directed by the initial motivation.
maybe we should go further. I should finish Hume, then maybe if we have time, discuss.
more Hume to do this?
Yes, I have.
Remember your questions and maybe we have more time.
Okay. So, two main works of Hume, Treatise of Human Nature and Inquiries, like Critique of Purism and, Prolegomena. The second one is written to simplify, maybe, I don't know, in a shorter volume, the ideas presented first. The point is, Malebranche's name appears 4 times in Inquiry. And Thomas Leonard, in his introduction to his translation of The Search After Truth, talks about a letter he wrote to a friend, in which he mentions that 4 books are required to understand the metaphysical parts of the treatise, and the first one is The Search After Truth. I haven't been able to find that letter. If anybody knows, please let me know about this letter. But he talks about such a letter. Anyway, Hume's analysis of causality. As you know very well, I think 99% in this room probably, Hume's analysis of causality has 2 sides maybe. He says experience cannot establish genuine causal links between events, but only correlations, concomitances, etc. We are inclined to formulate causal links on the basis of regularities or constant conjunctions. However, we may miss that. A good example for that is people in the Middle Ages thought that lightning causes thunder because thunder always follows lightning, right? As you see here. However, you know what happened later? People discovered electrical charges, which is a common element or factor behind lightning and thunder. So we don't observe the electrical charges first or initially, apparently, but it is there. Then it gives rise to the possibility that there might be always some unobservable factor behind 2, 3, 4, whatever correlated events. And this gives rise to the idea that experience is not a reliable ground to establish causal link. I mean the real efficient causality. Okay, the other option is whether we can infer the causality by reasoning. Hume gives several examples. Adam could not infer from fluidity and transparency of water that it would suffocate him, or from the light and warmth of fire that it would consume him. At the first one, we saw that. Or another example, the bullet ball example. I see a bullet ball is moving in a straight line toward another. I can conceive my different possible cases other than it's hitting the other. No a priori guarantee for their collision. Because every effect is a distinct event from its cause. They are distinct. I can conceive one without the other. And since I can separate them, they are conceivable independently. It's also possible that they cannot exist altogether. So it seems that David Hume supposes or presupposes here the thesis that conceivability implies possibility, which is famously discussed in contemporary metaphysics. There are some people who still follow this idea, and some people who reject this idea, some people who try to modify this idea under certain conditions. Okay, so what is then the origin of the idea of causality? It is not the relation between ideas which carries objective necessity. We can conceive the denial without contradiction. It is not a necessary relation between objects or events. We observe just constantly conjugate events, not any necessary link between them. In this context, he actually offers some criticisms of Locke's idea of identifying the human volition as the primary, example of causality, because the origin of the idea of power is not in objects observed or in us as willing. But Locke identified our volition, as the primary model of causality, active causes. We are conscious of the power of the will when we move our hands by its volitions. That was Locke's position. But Hume says we cannot derive from the idea of will the idea of power. We just observe that the motion of body follows the command of the will. We do not see any power in the cause which connects it to the effect. If by consciousness we perceive any power in the will, we must know this power. When we know power, we know that the very circumstance in which, in the cause by which it is enabled to produce the effect, we must know its connection with the effect, we must know the sacred union of body and soul. Why has the will an influence over the tongue or fingers, but not over the heart or liver? If you know that, you should also be able to answer this question. And against Malebranche, and this is, I think, the critical point. Some people consider, some scholars in literature consider Hume an occasionalist without God. And it's, I think, apparent because with respect to finite causality, he is very close to Malebranche, but furthermore, Hume says the whole idea of power is meaningless. Not says, but implies. Why? Malebranche, what did Malebranche do? Malebranche says finite beings are causally inert, but God is causally powerful, causally efficacious. No power in finite beings, power in God. Hume says there must be tension then within the system of Malebranche if it regards causal powers in nature meaningless. What is the ground to argue for the meaningful nature of divine power? Then, if we do not have a clear and distinct idea of power in things, it seems that our idea of power is not clear and distinct either. How can we then talk about divine power? He says. Then, the idea of universal energy or power of the supreme being cannot be acquired from experience either. Before going to his position on causality, here I would like to say Hume, Locke, and Berkeley. There is, I think, a reason why they are called empiricists, by the way. So, the origin of our ideas must be in experience. If you don't find the origin of your idea in experience, these are not meaningful. So, according to Hume, there are either relations of ideas or matters of fact. Once you talk about matters of fact, the ideas used should have an origination in experience if you have a meaningful talk. And the point here is, as far as I understand, Locke tries to find that origin in ourselves by considering the volition as the prime causality. Berkeley as well, he tries to find that origin in our experience by considering spirits as the prime agents of causality. But Hume says, no, it doesn't work. He admits that it doesn't work at the end of the day. And he altogether rejects the meaningfulness of the idea of power. But then, what he suggests is the following. After a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit, upon the appearance of one event, to expect its usual attendant, and to believe that it will exist. We feel this transition as an impression of reflection or internal sensation. And it is this feeling of determination that is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. Nothing further is in the case. So this is our feeling or habit, what we call the necessary connection of power, originates from here. This is something subjective, if you like, but not a kind of metaphysically objective principle. So the constant conjunctions gives the idea of the feeling of determination, and then it gives rise to the idea of power and necessary connection. We are determined by custom alone to expect a similar effect from the cause. And custom is very important. By the way, Hume doesn't deny causality. He considers causes in that way. Okay, we can consider them, constantly conjoined events, especially temporally conjoined events, which guide us in our practical life, but we don't have to, or we shouldn't derive any metaphysical lesson from this. This is what he tries to replace metaphysics, I think, with some kind of practical life philosophy. And I think this is also important before finishing this section, because in the afternoon, Douglas and Edward will talk about contemporary approaches to causation, and one of the, maybe two of the currently famous approaches to causality is the regularity analysis of causality and the counterfactual analysis of causality. And I think the seeds of these approaches can be found in Hume. He gives two different so-called, if you like, definitions of cause. The first, a cause is an object followed by another, and where all the objects similar to the first are followed by objects similar to the second. So a kind of regularity analysis. And the second, if the first object had not been, the second never had existed. Okay. A cause is an object followed by another, and whose appearance always conveys without the other. I think here the ontology of causal relata is sometimes use the term object, sometimes event. It's not so clear, I think, but maybe we can talk about later. And at the end of the day, the what we can call the meta principle of causality, that whatever has a beginning has also a cause of existence, is not an objective metaphysical principle. He rejects this as an objective metaphysical principle. It doesn't have to be, according to him. And I think I don't want to talk too much now on this issue, because in my presentation on Saturday, especially on this meta principle, I'd like to talk about by introducing Al-Ghazali's ideas as well. Thank you very much. I think we should go to lunch.
Okay.
But if there are very significant questions, more significant than the lunch,
That's what you should do. Nazif, in particular. During this session, perhaps for your surprise, I have listened to many ideas, concepts, even arguments, which echoes the work in Islamic literature, Islamic philosophy, and Islamic kalam, specifically. The last thing was the custom of you. This term, custom, as you know, is used by Al-Ghazali. Does anybody know if there is a comprehensive study, comparative study, of these philosophies, modern or European philosophies of the 17th century, as compared to the Kalam? I don't know myself, because I'm illiterate in this field, but I know about Kalam accurately. As far as these philosophies which you have surveyed, I'm unaware.
Some scholars pointed out the similarities in some introductory books, like Oliver Leaman's books, etc. Say to say Nasr, etc. Especially with Leibniz, the Kalam, Tebellemun, Malebranche, etc. I think it is a bit unfortunate to say that the book we produced out of the first conference at Harvard is now under proofreadings, the publication process. They promised me to send it, to prepare it before the conference. Unfortunately, it didn't complete it. One chapter in that book, I examine the Islamic roots of Cartesian occasionalism. From Descartes, Cordimo, Malebranche, all the Louis de la Forge, etc., all the Cartesian philosophers, natural philosophy in what sense there are some parallels with them among the mutakellimun, and whether there is a historical link between them. There is a chapter in that book. Maybe if it is published soon, you can read it.
Thank you.
Significant question. Maybe one here and then we go to lunch.
Maybe it's significant, I'm not sure, but it's a general question which is that I'm thinking about.
It has to be
Not
rigorous.
only with occasional or let's say in general with the Cartesian.
Aware of
We should think of
the need
body
not
and such
out
a
of
that.
context.
But when you say body, all body, that the inner body, and also everything has the same story, and they are totally like a mistake.
Apparently,
That
there
I
is
actually then we cannot find a place in this picture for the organism. So is it possible that still giving the efficient cause only to God and think of certain mutality, degrees of mutality, and then let's say you said the first order desires, can we attribute to the whole thing already, and then maybe with the higher degree of mutality we can attribute to the
Certainly, it's possible.
I know that sort of in this case we can think.
Yeah, certainly. These are just certain models of occasionalism. I mean, you can be occasionalist within a Cartesian ontology, you can be occasionalist even with a Berkeleyan idealist ontology. If you deny causality to the spirits, you are full occasionalist, even if you think there is no material substance. You know, you can change your ontologies by keeping the causal principle the same. You have different models of occasionalism. And whatever you talk is also meaningful, and maybe you can do that.
Because we can really equate all with new party being alive, but if we don't do this, we can attribute causality to God, but without it to everything, and then
It's possible. I mean, if you think possible in regard to occasionalism, it's possible.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.